Yeah. Allô? Oui, ça marche? Okay, let's start then. So this is my pleasure to give you this first lecture today. So I was asked to give a lecture on laser cooling and trapping. I'm Franck Pereira dos Santos. I'm working at CIRT in Observatoire de Paris. And you see that we have many head institutions, as many French labs. Okay, we are affiliated to Paris Sciences et Lettres, CNRS, Sorbonne Université, and the National French Laboratory for Metrology, which is the LNE. So just a couple slides to present myself and my institute. CIRT is a department of the Paris Observatory. We do research activities in mainly in time and frequency metrology. So we are associated to the French Metrology Institute, LNE, for that. We also have activities which are more relevant for astronomy and astrophysics, like in fundamental astronomy, definition of reference frames, celestial and reference frames, Earth rotations, and things like this. We also have people in the lab that do history of sciences, and mainly in astronomy. In this part, which is we call the LNE CIRT, we do our research activities are on atomic time scale. So we do produce, disseminate French atomic time, and we contribute to the French TAI, which is the International Atomic Time. We do research in atomic clocks, microwave, optical clocks. We do research and operate links to be able to do comparisons between clocks which are in remote places. And we have an activity, which is the one I'm leading, in atom interferometry and inertial sensors. So we are a team of 8 staff and 5 students and postdocs, and we do develop high-performance atom interferometers for inertial and gravity sensing, and you have pictures of some of the experimental setup we have, which operate either with trapped atoms or atoms in free fall, either simply falling or that we just launch upward in atomic fountain geometries. Okay, but this is not the topic of the day, so now you know who I am and where I work. So if you are interested by this, do not hesitate to look there and come to me so that we can discuss. There is a student from our group here, Jan. Where are you, Jan? Poor guy. So go to his posters and ask him questions if you have. So, just before starting to get into the hard stuff, just a bit of history on this laser cooling and trapping research theme. It's considered that the first observation of radiation pressure as something that a light beam would actually deflect the trajectory of an atom. That it was demonstrated in the 30s by a German scientist, German or Austrian, I don't remember, Otto Frisch. He would have a beam of thermal sodium atoms and a resonance lamp, and he could see the very tiny deflection of the beam trajectory due to the radiation pressure exerted by the light. And he was there very limited actually by the brightness of this lamp. And then, somewhat around the 60s, people understood that, by theoretical considerations, intensity gradients could lead to forces, and this dipole force was proposed to trap atoms as early in the 60s by Letokov, and it was used actually to trap small glass spheres by Ashkin. It was in the 70s that people proposed to use tunable lasers, which were intense, and that you could control the frequency to induce selective radiation forces, radioactive forces on atoms. And there were those two important proposals by Hensch and Chalo for atoms cooling. and also Wineland and Delmelt for ions. And this was really the theory of Doppler cooling that was invented at that time. But it's really in the 80s that this laser cooling and trapping of a neutral atom had this big boom with a lot of experimental breakthroughs in the domain. And you have here three of the pioneers of the field, which were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1997. So this is Steve Chu, Claude Cohen-Tanuji, and Bill Phillips, names that we will see in the course of the lecture. Laser cooling methods were really instrumental to many breakthroughs in atomic physics, and one of which is the demonstration of Bose-Einstein condensation in dilute gases. This was in 1995. And you can imagine, and this was like 2 years before the Nobel Prize for this laser cooling. So you can imagine that this was really a breakthrough, and it contributed to making this, I think, this award for the laser cooling pioneers at that time. And those guys, Eric Cornell, Wolfgang Ketterle, Karl Weinmann, we were the ones that made the first demonstration of BECs with rubidium sodium atoms, were also awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2001. Okay, more Nobel Prizes. More Nobel Prizes. So you know those guys, Serge Haroche. Dave Wineland was one of those who proposed this Doppler cooling theory in the 70s. And he was also the one that realized the first experiment of laser cooling of ions. This was end of the 70s, okay? And he got the Nobel Prize in 2012 for something which is not laser cooling, but for experimental methods to enable to measure, manipulate single atoms, individual quantum system, ions, atoms, photons. Because laser cooling is really instrumental for realizing accurate clocks, and in particular ion clocks, which was the research carried by, which is the research carried by Wineland, who trapped beryllium, mercury, aluminum ions to realize ultra-stable clocks, either in the microwave or in the optical domain. And this guy, which was Delmelt, who was the one who proposed also this Doppler cooling theory in the 70s with Wineland, was also awarded the Nobel Prize for something else. He did actually the second first laser cooling of ions. This was the very same year. So those two guys, they worked together. They made this proposal. Then they went and they did two different experiments in two different places at the same time, demonstrating this idea they had, but by independent means and in the independent teams. And they were almost not really aware that the others were really doing the same, and they published these two results the very same year. So Delmelt got the Nobel Prize, or part of it, for the development of the ion trap techniques. Okay. So I could even add one more, which was this guy. Maybe I will update my slides for the next time. Theodor Hensch, who was one of those people that proposed this laser cooling method, got also the Nobel Prize, but for something different, which was for his contribution to spectroscopic measurements of hydrogen and the invention of the frequency comb based on femtosecond lasers. Okay, so you see a lot of very talented scientists that have been very active since the invention of this laser cooling, either on the demonstration of the methods, but also on the application of laser-cooled atoms to other fields, like, for instance, frequency metrology. Okay, so this is the outline of the talk, and so I will briefly start by discussing what radiative forces are, okay, and then I will explain this Doppler cooling theory. And then I will present what this magneto-optical trap is. You all know, I guess, and I have a few slides on more technological aspects related to the realization of cold atoms. So let's start with radiative forces and very simple basic arguments. So you take a two-level atom, which has a ground state and an excited state, and this energy difference between the two. And you have an incoming photon, which has an energy h nu and a momentum h bar k. And you will have some absorption if this frequency of the laser match with the energy of the photon, basically matches the energy difference between the two states. So assuming that the atom is initially in the ground state, it simply absorbs the photon. And doing so, it absorbs its energy. So conservation of energy is the thing that makes that it goes to the excited state. But you also conserve to conserve momentum. The atom will change its momentum because it will absorb the momentum of the photon. So if the atom initially has a momentum p, then its momentum is p plus h bar k, where h bar k is the photon momentum. And this corresponds to a change in the velocity of the atom, which is pretty small, which is given by h bar k over m, which we call the recoil velocity, which amounts for rubidium to a few millimeters per second. So this is small with respect to the thermal velocity. Typically, atoms at thermal temperatures are, depending on their mass, have velocities in the range 100 to 1 kilometer per second. And then what happens to this excited atom? Well, generally the excited state will have a finite lifetime, and it will decay after some time, which is tau given by the inverse of the frequency width of the excited state. And this de-excitation occurs via spontaneous decay, eventually. And then the atom will scatter a photon in a random direction. Those absorption-emission cycles can occur at a very high rate, which is limited by this finite lifetime of the excited state, which is really large. Gamma is typically of millions per second or so. So that even if the transfer of momentum is really tiny, given that you can make many cycles, this leads to a mean force which can be really quite large. So the force will be of order of h bar k multiplied by gamma. And for a rubidium atom, this amounts to acceleration which are of the order of 10 to the 5 g. Okay? More than what any human being can sustain. And with such an acceleration, you can think of slowing down an atom which has a velocity of, say, 100 meters per second in a very short time of milliseconds and over a distance of only a few centimeters. Okay? So this transfer momentum is very small, but given that it can happen at very high rates, then we have a chance to efficiently affect the momentum of the atom. Okay, let's have a closer look at this energy conservation rule. So I start initially with atom in the ground state, and I have this photon with its energy. Okay, so the energy of the initial state is energy of the ground state of the atom, and its kinetic energy plus the photon energy. And after the absorption, the atom will be in the state E, excited state. With a momentum p plus h bar k. The energy, total energy here, is the energy of the excited state plus the kinetic energy of the atom that has changed, and no photon. The photon has disappeared. So I can equate those two energies, and I end up developing this, killing this p2 over 2m to this equation, which tells what shall be the frequency of the light for this process to be classically conserved, resonant somehow. So the frequency of the light is the difference in the frequency between the two states plus k dot v, which is the well-known Doppler shift. And there is this term, which is a recoil shift, which is related to the kinetic energy of a photon as momentum carried by an atom. This recoil shift is a few kilohertz typically, and one can also define an energy scale, which is this recoil energy we will see later, which is related to the kinetic energy, this kinetic energy But this is the recoil energy. So this Doppler shift, you all know. I mean, this is related to the fact that if the atom moves at a velocity v, and he receives the light that comes in front of him, he sees in its frame the frequency of the light shifted by k dot v, and this Doppler shift for thermal atoms is of the order of hundreds of megahertz, gigahertz. Okay, so this Doppler shift is really a big shift, and this recoil shift is really a small shift somehow. Okay, so then the problem of treating the interaction of atoms with an electromagnetic field, a laser, including the coupling of the atom to all the vacuum field, is actually a quantum problem. So we just derived considerations that were really classical so far. And one need to consider this atom, which has eventually a complex structure with many different atomic levels, which interacts with this laser field via this interaction, and is coupled to the vacuum field, where excited atoms can spontaneously de-excite via emission of photons in the vacuum field. Here we will consider that this laser light is very close to the resonance of this ground line in the atom, couples the two low-level states. And given that those energy differences are in general not degenerate, okay? If you have this laser field close to this energy difference, then you can consider just the atom as a two-level system, which makes things more simple. So we will ignore all those levels, and we will take, for the Hamiltonian of the atom, simply those ground which have zero energy, and this excited state which has an energy h bar omega 0. So the global Hamiltonian of the system is this free Hamiltonian of the atom, this Hamiltonian of the reservoir vacuum field, and the interactions of the atom with the laser light and with the vacuum field. Okay, so what is this interaction between the atom and the field? Here we will deal with electric dipole interaction. So this is the electric field, which couples to the electric dipole moment of the atom. And this coupling term, which is minus d dot E, okay, which is here like an operator, okay, that acts on an electric field, which contains also atom operators in terms of position. We can deal with some approximation with that. We deal with semi-classical approximation. So we will consider in this electric field that this operator is actually just reduces to simply the position of the atom, basically, classical. And with this rotating wave approximation that consists in dropping anti-resonant terms in the interaction, this coupling term writes as this, okay, where you have here the Rabi frequency, which characterizes the strength of the coupling between the light and the atom, and which is related to the product of the dipole and the amplitude of the electric field. So just remark, what is the link with the laser intensity, which is the strength of the coupling you have in the lab? Well, this intensity is the square of the electric field, so it scales like the Rabi frequency to the square. And one can define a normalized non-dimensional quantity by making basically the ratio of this Rabi frequency to the squared divided by gamma, which would be the frequency width of the excited state, say. This gives a dimensionless quantity, which is proportional to the intensity, and which is given by I divided by I sat being the saturation intensity. I guess you all know this. Okay, what are the important parameters that govern this evolution of the atoms? I mean, there's this coherent part of the interaction, which is related to the interaction with the laser light, for which we've seen the coupling is given by the Rabi frequency. Another very important parameter is the laser detuning to the atomic resonance. And for the incoherent part that corresponds to the interaction of the atom with the vacuum field, the relevant parameter is gamma, this spontaneous decay rate. So then we can how to calculate the force that an atom will see. We can look at we can use the description of this force as an operator in the Heisenberg operator picture. In this picture, position, momenta are operators which you can derive, and they obey evolution equations that are given by the derivative is basically a commutator with the Hamiltonian. So if you look at the derivative of the R operator, given that this Hamiltonian, in this Hamiltonian, everybody commutes with R except the kinetic energy, then this dr over dt is simply p. So here it's like classical. I mean, I derive the position, I get the momentum. And the force will be given by the derivative of this momentum. And here, again, looking at this commutator, you are left with basically this is a derivative or gradient with respect to R, because this is P. P is basically a derivative with respect to R. And the terms of the Hamiltonian that do not commute with P leave a gradient are the ones that are related to the coupling of the atom with the laser and the vacuum field. So this force is basically the gradient of this interaction. So this looks really not magical, because the force is the gradient of a potential somehow, okay, of a coupling. Then in this picture, to calculate the force, you have to calculate the expectation value of this force operator. And one can show that the expectation value of this coupling to the vacuum field is actually 0, and this is related to the fact that spontaneous photons are scattered in all directions. So on average, the force that the atoms see from those from the excitations, basically coupling to the vacuum field is 0. So you are left with this gradient of the interaction with the laser. So this is d dot E, and given that this gradient is basically the derivative over the R operator, basically. It only affects the electric field here, so you are left with the scalar product of the dipole operator times the gradient of the electric field. Okay, and this is the expectation value of those operators. So now we will make some approximations, and the first one is a semi-classical operation, semi-classical approximation, where we will calculate the force at the position of the atom and for its momentum that we will consider as a classical quantity. So we replace basically operators in the electric field by the, say, mean, by the expectation value basically of the operators. So then this simplifies to calculating the expectation value of the dipole time the gradient of the electric field, which is here a classical quantity. A second approximation is related to the fact that this dipole evolves at a rate which is governed by those time scales, the gravity frequency and the decay of the excited state. And it's something that is actually much faster than typical changes in the atom position momentum. Okay? So that I can replace in this equation d by its steady state. Then how to calculate this will come next. But so that this force is simply the expectation value of the dipole operator in the steady state times the gradient of the electric field. Okay, so how do we calculate this expectation value of the dipole operator? This can be done using optical block equations, which allow to treat both coherent and incoherent processes. Optical block equations are, I don't want to enter that much into the details of those calculations. I think you probably all have been introduced to this optical block equations. They are equations of the evolution of the internal state matrix density, and it is given by this. So here is the coherent part, and this is how we treat incoherent part coupling to the vacuum field, restricting basically the evolution to the evolution of the atom states. And in this picture, the average dipole is given by the trace of d times this density matrix, which is related to these coherencies of the state matrix density. So there is a bit of algebra which I don't want to detail here. I will give you references where to read how one can solve those optical block equations. But in the end, one finds this expression for the steady state dipole. It contains actually two components, two contributions. Sorry, up. Okay. So this is proportional to the dipole of the atom, of the transition. There is this factor where this parameter S, which is the saturation parameter, enters. Okay? And there is one term here which is in phase with the electric field. So this is basically related to the real part of the polarizability. Here I'm looking at how the dipole behaves and follows the excitation of the electric field. So there are two components. One is a component which is in phase with the electric field. And it leads to a conservative force. And the property of this force is that it's basically zero when you are at resonance, when the detuning delta is zero. And you have a second term, which is related to the imaginary part of the polarizability, and which is related thus to actually absorption, which is out of phase with the electric field, and this leads to a dissipative force, which is actually max at resonance. So when you take this expression and you put it in the expression of the force, and you average over time, you find actually two contributions. So these are the two contributions in the force, which I've already mentioned. This dissipative force is what we call the radiation pressure force. Okay? It's really linked to the transfer of momentum in the resonance scattering processes, but it is governed by the scattering rate, gamma prime, which is gamma over 2 times S divided by 1 plus S, where S is this saturation parameter. And the second force is a dissipative force. So this is the dipole force, which you can interpret as a position-dependent light shift, which is due to spatially varying intensity. Okay, it's related to the gradient of the intensity. And you can understand this force as arising for redistribution of photons in the laser field by absorption and stimulated emission of photons. Okay? So this is the expression of the force, and one can show that it derives from a dipole potential which has this form. So let's have a look at those two different contributions. The first, radiation pressure, which we discussed as related to absorption and spontaneous emission cycles that happen at this rate. One can write it this way, h bar k gamma over 2 S divided 1 plus S, where with S is this saturation, generalized saturation parameter. Or you can also write it this way, you will find in textbooks sometimes, okay? Looking at this, you see that it actually saturates when the intensity gets very large, so you put the coupling omega to infinity, and you have a maximum force, which is h bar k gamma over 2. So the atom absorbs photons and re-emit at a rate which is gamma over 2. So those cycles happen at a rate gamma over 2. And the transfer momentum for each cycle is h bar k. So this is really the same expression as the one we just had at the very first slides on what the force could be. This is a plot of this force normalized to the maximum value as a function of the detuning. Okay? You see that at low intensity, so when omega is smaller than gamma, the width of this force with respect to the detuning is actually given by gamma. So you see, you increase the coupling, the force gets a bit bigger, but the width somewhat remains the same. It's related to gamma. So this is putting here, basically here, say, this intensity as something small with respect to gamma. But if you increase the intensity, so you increase the coupling such that Rabi frequencies exceed the gamma, then the width is proportional to omega. And this is what we call power broadening. So you can act on the atom in the frequency domain on the range which is related to the finite width of the excited state, but if you put a lot of power intensity, you can go beyond this. And that's the idea. So let's now look at what happens if I have an atom which moves at velocity v, and I shine a laser at resonance on the atom. Well, in its frame, the atom will see a Doppler shift that corresponds to a detuning kV. So the force in the atomic frame, basically, or the force that the atom sees, is simply this expression where you just replace the detuning by this Doppler shift. Okay? So you see that if you have, say, a small intensity or so, you will start decelerating the atom with this force, but the force will be reducing drastically when the velocity will have changed by an amount which becomes of order of gamma. Okay? And this corresponds to velocity which are larger than this limit velocity, which depends on gamma. And for rubidium atoms, hey, this gives a few meters per second. So you have an atom which is resonant with the laser field. Say here you start, for instance, with v equals 0. Then you get pushed, and when kV becomes larger than gamma, then this force drops down. So the atom has received a few kicks. His velocity is now a few meters per second, but then the force intensity decreases a lot. So how can I use this to actually stop an atom which has an initial velocity which is a kilometer per second? Okay. And one idea is to use this trick of the Zeeman slower. So how can I keep an atom in resonance while I'm sending this laser beam to decelerate the atom? And this idea was from Bill Phillips. It was to tune the energy of the atomic state with a magnetic field. So the velocity will change, Doppler shift changes, but if I have a handle on this energy difference between the atom, I can make such that I tune it so that when the atom velocity changes, the energy difference between the two states changes in a way that the atom stay in resonance with the light. Okay? So for that, one can use the Zeeman effect. So on a very simple model, J equals 0, J equals 1 transition, you see that you have those magnetic Zeeman levels which you leave the degeneracy in a magnetic field. And then this frequency difference between the two states, so the resonance frequency of the laser, depends on B, okay? The amplitude of the magnetic field you applied, if you select proper polarization and states. So their idea was to have an atomic beam source where the atom would go out at a relatively high velocity, and that would enter a magnetic field which was shaped in a tapered way, so that the amplitude is max at the beginning and drops down to 0 at the end. And the idea was to tune here. So you send the cooling light here. Basically, you can put it somewhat on resonance or not too far from the bare atom without magnetic field. And at this position, the Zeeman shift compensates the Doppler shift. Okay? So you tune the field such that you have a Zeeman shift at the beginning that matches this big Doppler shift of atoms that go at hundreds of meters per second. And you can pattern, shape this B field profile in an optimized way, so that it varies and compensate by the Zeeman shift, the change in Doppler shift, while the atoms are decelerated. They remain on resonance, and for that you need a B field typically of order of kilogauss, because typically these shifts here are of order of megahertz per Gauss. So you have atoms at gigahertz frequency shifts, and with a kilogauss, then you can tune this laser on resonance with fast atoms. Okay. So this is what they did in 1982. This is the experiment, the same. They have this oven, this solenoid, which was patterned to have this profile. And then they would analyze with a laser beam that would cross the atomic beam with an angle, that they will sweep the frequency, and they look at the fluorescence, so that they have a spectroscopic resolved fluorescence measurement of the velocity of the atoms. And they could see in the output velocity profile, tuning the light such that it would be resonant with this velocity class, a large change of the velocity of the atom and the appearance of a bright peak of slow atom at the output of the Zeeman slower. And they could slow down not to 0, but to about 40% of the initial thermal velocity. And they could make such that the atom would have absorbed, say, 50,000 photons, which they would not be able to do if one would not have patterned this magnetic field in an optimal way. Okay, so let's look now at the second contribution to the force, which is the dipole force. So this expression, the expression of the force is given here. So this is the gradient of this saturation parameter, which is related to the Rabi frequency. So this is a null at resonance, and it has the property of changes sign with the detuning, because you see it scales like the detuning. So it's a dispersive force, and I discussed already that one can show that it derives from a potential. So if you look at things in the low saturation regime, which means that the saturation parameter is very small to 1, this dipole potential is simply given by h bar delta over 2 times the saturation parameter, and the force by its gradient. Okay. If you consider large detunings, then the saturation parameter writes like this, and this dipole potential is simply given by h bar omega squared over 4 delta. This is the light shift of the energy state related to the interaction of the atom with the off-resonant laser field. Okay. So one can consider that in this large detuning limit, this potential acts as a shift of the energy states, the so-called light shift. Okay? So if the detuning is negative, this potential is actually attractive. The atoms will be attracted towards the maxima of the intensity. If you choose the detuning positive, you have a repulsive potential. So the atoms will be repelled from the regions of maximum intensity. The spontaneous emission rate here is given by gamma over 2 times S, and in this limit you can write this spontaneous emission rate and look at the ratio with the dipole potential, and you see that the ratio of those two quantities scale like gamma over delta. So if you have at the limit where you have, say, infinite power and you can keep the coupling large, going to very large detuning makes that the relative contribution of the spectrum rate with respect to the dipole force, so the dipole potential goes to 0. Okay, so you can go in a regime where spontaneous emission can be ignored, and the total force is actually dominated by this dipole force, which is purely conservative. Okay, so you put the atoms in this dipole force, and then they see a conservative force. So these are some examples of what can do by using this dipole force. It's very popular to use, say, rate detuning to realize attractive potentials, such as cross dipole traps. And the atom will be trapped at the crossing of the two beams. And you have here absorption imaging of atoms which are trapped at the crossing. This is a very popular geometry for in the community. Another interesting geometry is related to optical lattices. So you can have beams from different directions that do interfere, that creates patterns, gratings, by the modulation of the light over a period which is a fraction of the wavelength, and this leads to either 1D, 2D, 3D optical lattices in which you can trap the atoms. And you have here a reference to a review paper by Emmanuel Bloch, and I think you will have a lot on those optical lattices to come in the courses that David Clément will do. Okay, if you switch to blue detuning, then you have a repulsive potential, and you can use that to repel the atoms. So this is a picture of an experiment in a laboratoire Kastler-Bossel in the early 90s, where they would shine a laser beam onto this prism with an angle such that this internal reflection is actually total. So you have an evanescent blue detuned field here that basically repels the atom. So you just let cold atoms fall, and they will see this repelling potential on which they will bounce. Okay, and you have here the bouncing of the cold atoms and the many bounces that they. Oh, isn't that cool? You know, this was the time where I was in a class préparatoire, preparing for the competitive exams we have to get into the high schools in France. Okay, and there was this Fête de la Science in October or so, and our teacher, physics teacher, would take us, and we went to the École Normale. So we visited the labs, theory. Somebody told us about Romanesco cauliflower, you know, like with these fractal structures, and then we went down to the basement, and a guy opened the door. It was all dark inside. They had the goggles on their heads, and they said, "Here we make atom bounce on mirrors." Oh! I think this is the reason why I'm here today. You know, this was really great. And you can use also this blue detune light to actually shape potential to realize light sheets that would repel the atom, and tubes in which you will confine atoms where the intensity is 0. And this was actually used to create some kind of box-shaped potential. You know, a lot of the theory of degenerate gases has been done in the context of basically no trapping or atom just confined in the box. But so far, in the beginning, people have used traps. So they had a theory where you had to put the interaction with the trap. And some people tried to make traps which were like a box so that they could see what happens in the really very simple textbooks development of the early theoretical works. And this you can do by appropriate like a tube and two light sheets that make really sharp edges. And in the end, you end up with atoms trapped in a 3D box. Okay. So instead of having this, like, you know, Gaussian shape or Thomas Fermi whatever profile for the population of the atom in the box, you have like a rectangular homogeneous density, which is neat. Okay. So this is the end of radiative force. Let's go to Doppler cooling now. So how can I use these tools to cool the atoms? So the idea is to send two rate detuned counterpropagating laser beams onto an atom that moves at a given velocity. Being rate detuned, so this frequency of the laser is below basically the energy difference between the two states. If I look at what are the frequencies that the atom see in its frame, those two laser beams get Doppler shifted in opposite directions. Okay, so the wave that comes to the atom gets shifted up, while the one that pushes from the back is actually even more detuned. Okay, so you see that this beam is closer to resonance than this one. So that's the reason why it will be more effective and it will push harder the atom that comes in front than the one that pushes at the back. Okay, and you can see here that because of this imbalance between the left and right beams, one can have a net force which is actually opposed to the motion of the atom. This is a very simple picture. And then we have all the tools now to calculate what this force is. Especially if we go to the low saturation regime, we can just add the two forces as they are independent. Okay, so each laser beam acts independently on the atom, and the net force is the sum of the two forces. This is an approximation because at high intensity you cannot neglect the fact that the two lasers are together, and processes such that I absorb in a wave and I remit in another one are possible. So things get more complicated, but in the low saturation regime, you are allowed to just simply sum the two. So the sum is then the sum of this plus k and the sum of this force with a minus k, with this saturation parameter, where in addition to the tuning of the light, you have to have the opposite Doppler shift, depending on whether the beam goes from the left and the right. And this leads to this force, so which is 0 at velocity 0. Okay? If the atom is at rest, it sees the same Doppler shift from the two waves. So the two forces compensate. There is no force. But when the velocity gets to the right or to the left, then the force pulls the atom towards the null velocity. One can linearize this force in the range where the velocity is actually small with respect to so such that the Doppler shift is smaller than gamma, basically. And you can see here it's linear, so it's a friction force, which means that the force is opposed to the velocity, and the friction coefficient is alpha. One can calculate this parameter. Okay, it depends on the detuning, the gamma, the intensity, and so and so. And it is maximum when the detuning equals minus gamma over 2, and at this limit, it equates to 2h bar k square S0. S0 being the saturation parameter at resonance, which is I divided by I sat. Okay? So what is the equation of motion of an atom there? Well, the derivative of the momentum is the force. And you see a very simple differential equation whose solution is just an exponential decay. The velocity will go down to 0 in a time which is this damping time going, which is m divided by alpha, and what you can rewrite as this. And to give orders of magnitude, if you take a rubidium atom and a moderate saturation parameter of 0.1, say, this is about 100 microseconds. So you see this damping time is actually quite fast. Huh? One can actually slow down an atom very efficiently in a short time. Constance, where are you? You have everything you need here. Yeah? Okay. One can generalize this to 3D. You just have to send this two counterpropagating wave from the three different directions. Again, if you are in the low saturation regime, the net force is simply the sum of the 6 forces. And if you take beams with all same intensities and you look at what is the limit in the expression in the limit of small velocities, you find this friction force that acts on the vector velocity. Okay, and here you have a nice picture of optical molasses of sodium atoms. So you see here the shadow of the 6 beams, and this bright fluorescing cloud of sodium atom trapped in the optical lattices, in the optical molasses. Okay, so I told you, okay, this is very efficient. It damps the velocity from initial velocity to 0. then I have atoms at 0 velocity, they don't move, that's extraordinary. Life is a bit more complicated because they will have a residual motion, and they will not be all at 0 velocity. And this comes from the fact that this friction force that we derive is just an average of the force experienced by the atoms. But there are fluctuations of the force which are related to those scattering events. In this expression of the force operator, when I look at the expectation value, I drop the terms which were related to the coupling with the vacuum field. These are the terms that are related to the fact that spontaneous emissions occur in different directions, and this is responsible for fast fluctuation of the force, which average to 0 but are not 0. And one can understand this dynamic of the residual momentum in the momentum space as a Brownian motion where the atom undergoes random kicks, h bar k, in different directions when the photons are actually absorbed and emitted. So if I just add here fluctuating force to this mean force, which is the friction, I can basically solve this equation in this way. And using that, I can calculate what is the evolution of the kinetic energy. I will be interested in understanding what is the residual temperature of the sample, what is the residual kinetic energy of the sample when I am at a steady state, say. Okay? So I look at the evolution of the kinetic energy, which is given by this. And so this is the product of the P times the derivative of P. So I re-inject this equation there. And I find that this evolution of the kinetic average energy is given by this damping term plus this term, which is related to correlation between the momentum and the fluctuation of this force. One can also inject this into that. You end up with two terms. One which, well, this you can go out from the mean. So this basically is the average force, so it's 0. But you have a residual contribution here, which is relative to the like correlation function of the force at distant times, which is the momentum diffusion coefficients. Okay. So this is just algebra, but that doesn't tell you what is the expression of this fluctuating force. And we will not write this force somehow. We will try to find a way to express this in a simple way. But this comes in the next slide. So if I have this equation for the kinetic energy, then I can calculate what the steady state is, and at the steady state, I find this mean of the momentum squared, which is given by basically a ratio of this momentum diffusion coefficient to the friction force. Okay, and if I this will basically correspond to an effective temperature, which is related to this kinetic energy, which will be then given by this. Well, I simply enter into this energy, thermal energy, these factors here, and I end up with basically kT equal d over alpha. So the equilibrium temperature is related to the ratio of this momentum diffusion coefficient to the friction force, to the friction coefficient. So how can I calculate the momentum diffusion coefficient? Well, it's a bit a nightmare to write this force, fluctuating force, and the coupling with all the vacuum fields and so and so. We can calculate it somewhat simply with considering that looking at this equation, D is related to the rate at which the kinetic energy increases in absorption emission cycles. Okay, so if I have over a time t a certain number of momentum kicks of amplitude h bar k in a random direction, this is a Brownian motion. Okay, so this leads to an increase in the momentum, which is given by the variance. So this is the variance. So it's related to the step in the momentum space to the square times the number of events, okay, which I have to divide by 3 because they go in 3 different directions. And this leads to a rate of increase that I can calculate by just taking this and divide it by the time during which I had this delta n momenta kicks. And I end up with 1/3 of h bar k squared times r, where r is the scattering rate, the rate of the scattering events. Okay, so here we have a simple expression for this momentum diffusion coefficient, which is 1/6 of h bar k squared times this rate of scattering events. What is this rate of scattering events? Well, if I am in the molasses, I have actually 6 beams. Each beam they have identical saturation parameters as 0. I have a certain rate for the absorption of photons, and at each absorption I have also a kick in a random direction because I have all those 6 beams, and the same at the spontaneous emission. Okay. So this is what this rate of event is in the low saturation regime, and if you plug this here, then you end up with this expression for the diffusion momentum coefficient. So now you have everything you need to calculate what is the equilibrium temperature. So you take the expression of the friction force, noting that it is bounded by this alpha max, okay, for this detuning of minus gamma over 2. Note that the friction depends on the saturation parameter, but the momentum diffusion coefficient also. So that in the end, when you take the ratio, you have this quantity which is independent from the intensity of the light. Okay, so the equilibrium temperature in the Doppler cooling model is independent of the intensity, but it depends on the detuning and gamma, and it has for this delta equal minus gamma 2, for which the friction is max, then the temperature is mean, and you have a minimum temperature which is given by h bar gamma over 2 divided by kb. And if you make this numerical calculation for rubidium, this corresponds to 145 microkelvin. In this this I cannot demonstrate here, but generally this theory, actually the momentum distribution is a Gaussian distribution, okay, with RMS velocity width, which is related to this temperature. So you see that it would correspond to something like 12 centimeters per second for rubidium atoms. Okay, then important parameter is what is the efficiency that this molasses has in terms of capturing atoms at high velocities. Well, the capture velocity, so this is the maximum velocity I can slow down and trap in my optical molasses, is actually related to the interaction length. So basically the size of the beam. So if I just use this equation, so m v dot equal f, which depends on v, and I differentiate v dot as v times dv over dx, I have this equation that on x and v. Okay. So that tells that if my velocity goes from a max velocity to 0, I need a certain length L. Okay, and this is the equation you need to calculate the link between this maximum velocity that can be trapped and the length of the interaction, so the size of the beam. So you do some algebra, blah, 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 and you get this VC. It scales like L to the power 1/4. This is not very fast, huh? So if you want a lot of atoms in the molasses, more and more and more and more, you have to increase the size of the beam like crazy. And the typical parameters are such that if you have say 1-inch beam or so, and you operate in the regime of relatively low saturation, you have this velocity, which is 13 meters per second. It can be a bit higher. In practice, you do not use very low intensity, because this gets higher when you increase the intensity. But this is just that those expressions are valid in the low saturation regime. But you see that the scaling is like to the power 1/4. So if you take here 1, you have a moderate increase. If you just multiply by 10, say this does not increase that much what the capture velocity is. And also one can show that for typical parameters, the optimal detuning is around -3 gamma. So these are like typical parameters you would use in the experiment to optimize the capture efficiency of the molasses and collect a large number of atoms. Okay, does this theory work? Actually, very early, after people have been realizing for the first time those optical molasses and tried to measure the temperature, they saw temperatures which were very different from this Doppler limit. So it took some time for people to get really convinced that it was true that the atoms were colder, because they wanted to see this curve, which was the Doppler theory, and what they would measure was there. So they did measurements of the temperature by whatever possible means, and all the measurements were in agreement that indeed the temperature is much smaller than this Doppler theory. And they published this paper and say, okay, we observe, we don't understand, but here is what we measure. This temperature much lower than this Doppler limit, with a scaling with the detuning that is completely different than what we expect, like going like decreasing with the detuning, where in the Doppler limit you have this optimum here somewhere. Well, we will come to that later, of course. But does this theory work? Well, sometimes it works. If you take metastable helium atoms, for instance, and you measure the temperature in the molasses, and you compare with Doppler theory, perfect agreement. Perfect. If you take mercury atoms, then the situation is a bit more complicated. Mercury atoms, have many different isotopes. And some isotopes do match with Doppler theories, and others do not. This is surprising, but here is something that will be related to what we will see later. It actually works with isotope which has 0 nuclear spin, and they have actually they have a ground state which is like S0. Okay, so they have no structure in the ground state, while those who have this nuclear spin have hyperfine structure and many degenerate states in the ground state, and that's really the difference that explains that in some cases Doppler theory applies, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so now we will discuss the magneto-optical trap. So let's consider a very simple J equals 0 to J equals 1 transition, pretty much like the one we saw when we discussed this Zeeman law. And here we apply a magnetic field gradient. So the amplitude of the field is linear with the position, and we use a counterpropagating laser beam. And here with opposite circular polarization. So far I've not discussed the impact of polarizations of the light, but here it plays a crucial role. So you have this configuration, sigma plus, sigma minus, opposite circular polarization. And if you look at this energy picture, you see that the magnetic field and the polarization induce position-dependent detunings. Okay, so the sigma plus and sigma minus light are resonant with different transitions, starting from 0. So sigma minus goes to mj equal -1, sigma plus goes to mj equal +1. Okay, but the energy of those states depend on the position. So that this detuning of the light here is this, say, the bare detuning that I have for the two beams, okay? Plus or minus something that is related to the magnetic field, and this depends on the position of the atom. And it is opposite for the two waves. And this leads to an unbalanced radiation pressure for the atoms that are away from the 0 magnetic field. So if I am at this position here, X positive, you see that my sigma minus light is much more resonant than my sigma plus light, which is here, but the resonance to the state is there. So you have a big detuning for this guy when you are here, while you are more resonant with the sigma minus. So the sigma minus beam pushes more. So I am at a positive This is 0, okay? I am at x positive, and this sigma minus pushes me back close to the 0, more than the one that pushes me in the other direction. So it's really here again an imbalance in the radiation pressure, pretty much like what we saw in the Doppler cooling method, that is used to make a force that depends on the position. And this leads to actually a trapping force that will actually bring the atom back to the center being the point where the magnetic field is 0. Okay? So one can calculate what this force is. It's not very complicated. You have to consider this radiative force, radiation pressure force, and enter those detunings that depend on the position. And you can linearize it for small displacement. And you have this coefficient. So now the overall equation of motion of atoms in the magnetical trap for small displacement and velocities is this equation where the force is given by a friction and restoring force to initial position. And you see that this is the equation of a damped harmonic oscillator. So you understand that the atom, depending on the parameters, will return to 0, oscillating or going overdamped or whatever. In this magneto-optical trap, Doppler cooling is still active, and it will determine the temperature of the atom. So this force here we discussed, which is related to the position, adds up to the one that is acting on the velocity. So the temperature is related to this friction and the momentum diffusion coefficient again. And if I have here equally distributed energy between what is the kinetic energy and the exponential energy that derives from this restoring force, I can write that equate this kinetic energy and this position dependent energy, and with that I can calculate what is, for the optimal detuning, the size of the cloud at equilibrium. And if I do the numerical calculation for the typical gradients we have in modes of about 10 Gauss per centimeter, and a small saturation parameter to remain in this low saturation regime where I can calculate this, you end up with sizes of a few tens of micrometer. Okay. So one can generalize it to 3D again. So you need 3 pairs of counterpropagating beams with opposite circular polarization, such as sigma plus, sigma minus, sigma plus, sigma minus, sigma plus, sigma minus. And to generate a configuration where you have a gradient of magnetic field in the 3 directions, you can do simply by having a set of 2 coils where you run current in opposite directions. So it's in an anti-Helmholtz configuration. One can show that here, if you make the development, you have a gradient in all 3D directions. Okay? And this is a picture I got from the internet of a typical implementation of a MOT. So you have those big coils here. And you have optical axes here in the cell, pretty much like this picture. With here, you see, quarter wave plate to adjust the circular polarizations. Okay. Beauty of magneto-optical traps. Isn't that beautiful? You know, they told me that the atoms were bouncing, but they did not show me the cold atom trap. That was enough to trap me, you know. Would have seen this? I don't know. So these are pictures I took from here and there from the internet of different magneto-optical traps. Neat thing is that different atoms have different transitions, which lie in the when you're lucky, in the optical domain, in the visible range, so that you can see your MOT with your bare eye. And sodium, ytterbium, strontium, so you have something like yellow, green, red. Lithium, lithium. Not so red. This is the picture I got. Rubidium, I think a bit a cheat because rubidium, it's really on the edge of the sensitivity of the eye. So you see something reddish when there is a lot of atoms. You have here erbium, which has a nice yellow, and many more. But not so many different colors because here we have somewhat the different colors of the visible range. Okay, so pretty much alike in the case of the optical molasses, one is interested by determining what is the capture velocity of the MOT. So I don't want to do the algebra here, but it has a different scaling with the interaction length, which is not power 1/4, but 1/2, okay? And interesting is that it is actually more efficient. The capture velocity for 1 inch for the very same parameters that I use for the molasses is something like 20 meters per second. And in practice, operating a MOT, you want to use large saturation parameters. You want to have detunings in the range of, say, -3, -5 gamma. And you optimize those parameters to optimize the capture efficiency, which are not the parameters for which the temperature is the coldest. Okay, so you operate your MOT, and you have a relatively high Doppler temperature in the MOT because you are at relatively close detunings. And the temperature of the MOT is actually somewhat also a bit influenced by the magnetic field gradient. And it will be typically of the order of tens of microkelvin. So lower than this Doppler limit model, okay? But somewhat not so low. So if I go back on my slides, well, this is how the temperature behaves when you go to very large detunings, and then continues to drop down, okay? And you will operate your MOT in this range where you have several tens of microK, but going this way can bring you even much lower. But if you are here and you put your MOT there, you don't trap atoms because the detuning is so large that the radiation force is very weak. Okay. Bon. Then, a bit of magneto-optical traps dynamics. This is the equation that governs the evolution of the number of atoms that I trap in the MOT. Okay? So I start with no atom, and the number of atoms in the MOT increases because I have a certain loading rate. So this is the flux of incoming atom, okay, that will be trapped. This will be typically on the range of 10 to the 8 to 10 to the 10 atoms per second. And then, would this be there only? The number of atoms will increase up to infinity. But there are losses which I have to take into account. And the first one is related to one-body loss rate. So this is a collision with the background gas. So we live at ultra-high vacuum, in the ultra-high vacuum domain at pressures in the range 10 to minus 9 to 10 to minus 11 millibar typically. And this makes that this rate is on the order of 0.01 to 1 or so, okay? And then when the density of the cloud will become large, because you have started accumulating a large number of atoms, you will be limited by two-body losses, which are really related to the collisions of the atoms, trapped atoms, among themselves, okay? This depends very much on the atom because it's related to the very details of the interaction potential between the atoms, but it's usually in the range of 10 to the minus 9 to the minus 11 centimeter cube per second. So you see that when you reach densities of the order of 10 to the 11, 12, this will exceed this loss rate and will be the dominant source of losses in the MOT. So in the end, you start loading the atom, and you end up with a stationary number of atoms in the MOT, which is related to the fact that losses and incoming flux are balanced. Would you be simply limited by this one body loss? You will have an exponential decay, growth, invert decay of the number of atoms up to a steady state that is proportional to the loading rate and inversely proportional to the loss rate. If you have a large, if you can neglect, if you're in a regime where this one body loss rate is much smaller than the two body loss, then the number of atoms you have in the steady state do scale like the square root of the flux. So if you're in this linear range, you increase the flux by 10, you get 10 times more atoms. If you're in this range, it's only a factor 3, okay? And things get much more complicated in practice in many of in the typical experiments where you want to have a very large number of atoms in the bot, because you have other processes that are at play and that are related to photon reabsorption. So the atoms do scatter photons in whatever directions, and those photons have a certain probability to get reabsorbed by another atom in the cloud before exiting the cloud. And this leads to a force that repels the atoms, basically. It's like some kind of repulsive force, and it will tend to increase the size of the cloud, up to typically few millimeter, even centimeter size, okay? This happens as soon as the density is of order of 10 to the 10 atoms per centimeter cube, and typical atom numbers of 10 to the 8, okay? And people do work on studying those modes in those crazy regimes where the number of atoms is as high as possible, like 10 to the 10 or even more. And they show that the behavior, the dynamic behavior of the magneto-optical trap is very interesting because it has it has dynamical instabilities. So I don't know if you did your MOT. Sometimes you can see a MOT where fluorescence breathes. You can see that atoms circulate, like in a ring shape, okay? And here you have a picture of the cloud radius that behaves on time. So this is a steady state of the MOT, okay? We load, we are in this range where the number of atoms does not change much, but the cloud size exhibits oscillations. And this is only coming from the basic equations of this radiative force, taking into account those photon reabsorption mechanisms. So this is a field of research of its own to study the dynamical behavior of motes at a very large number of atoms. Okay, just to complete the picture of this magneto-optical trap. So 3D magneto-optical traps are great, but people also realize the 2D motes. The very first implementation of that was by this Kai Dickman. This was in Amsterdam. Actually, they wanted to do a super big 3D mote, okay? So they had shaped the coils and they said, we want to have a big mote, and we have those reabsorption processes are a bit a problem. So what if I would make my mote a bit elongated? Then, if the mote is very elongated, then the probability for the photon to go out without knocking another atom is a bit better, because when they go out of the size, so they said, okay, we will make a mote a bit weird with this coil arrangement. So we make large beams in the transverse direction, and we try to make a gradient, extend the geometry, trying to make it very elongated. And when they did that, depending on the parameters, they could see a very bright beam coming out. This you can also see, it's purely a two-dimensional effect. If you just take this 2D mote, real mote, pure 2D mote, so you have only those 4 coils that do generate a quadrupole field, but which is really 2D. So there is no gradient along this line, and you use only beams in the perpendicular direction. You basically slow down the transverse velocity of the atom, guide them over 0, and along the other direction, they're actually free. They are free, but if they enter the zone where they get trapped radially, they have a sufficiently small longitudinal velocity that they can stay enough to be damped to 0, then they escape. You make a small hole, and they escape through the hole. And this allowed people to produce actually very intense flux of slow atoms of say 10 to the 10 atoms per second at really moderate velocities, 10 to 20 meters per second, that one can use to actually load the 3D mode. So it's the source, a pre-source for the 2D mode, which is for the 3D mode, which is really efficient. Okay, so to end up, I will go through. I am on time, but you stole me 10 minutes, you know. So I will be brief, but a bit on the technology aspect. So one can realize mods with alternative arrangements than this standard 6-beam. You can retroreflect 2 beams on the surface, and the retroreflected beam produce the 2 missing pair, the two beams that are missing. Okay. People have also realized the mods with a single beam. So you shine this single beam on this grating. The grating produces diffracted orders that go in the different directions. So you have a single beam normal to the grating. You have 4 other beams that are generated by these are the diffraction orders of a 2D grating, okay? And you have the 6th beam is simply the 0 order. So this is the reflected beam. So in this geometry, you see, well, you have those 2 coils. You have a single beam, so it's somewhat less messy than all those beams and 6 directions and so. But you need this fancy grating. People also realized along the same idea, actually earlier in the past, mods with a single beam using a pyramid. So you have a hollow pyramid, and you can realize that if I shine here a sigma minus, sigma plus, or sigma minus beam, this produces, by the many reflection in the pyramid, all the 6 beams that I need to do my magneto-optical trap there. And they could trap atoms in this. They even used conical mods. So a single beam in a cone, and they have a mod. Great. One can also play with the arrangement of the coils. Instead of, to generate this magnetic field, you just use those 2 big coils, okay? But you can think of replacing those coils by, say, straight wires, and you can also realize quadrupole geometries only with a set of straight wires. And in this picture here, they could trap an atom below this structure where the wires would come from the top and where the beams of the mod were actually retroreflected onto the surface that was coated with gold. Okay? So what are the interests of those geometries? They are somewhat a bit simpler. That leaves more optical access because you have less beams, okay, to do very complicated things, like you'll see in the next lectures, where people do crazy arrangements of beams or whatever, lattices plus dipole plus whatever. And at some point in the experiment, it's a problem that I'm missing optical ports, you know. Okay, how can I generate a source? Well, you can have, you can realize atomic vapors to start with, to load your molas, to load your MOT, which you can have because you have, say, atoms which are contained in a reservoir, which is an ampoule, like this is for rubidium, or like dispensers. You shine a current and you release bursts of vapor of typically alkali atoms with these things. You can more classically produce effusive beams, so you have an oven, you heat up, you make hole, and then you have a stream of fast atoms, which are thermal, which you have to slow down using this Zeeman slower, or actually chirp lasers, which I not discussed, but it's an alternative method. This makes the experiment a bit longer because you need the Zeeman slowing distance and so on, so on, so on. But you have compact setups, very compact actually, that can produce cold atom beams in a very optimized way, and this is even commercial somewhat if you are able to buy from this company. And you can do also 2D MOTs. So you use a package of a 2D MOT that contains light, reservoir of rubidium, and the vacuum chamber that we do at CERT. And this is a very intense source of slow atoms. So, if I have to compare those different sources, I can benchmark them in terms of flux, size, the vacuum I need, and the complexity. So early developments were made with either vapor or atomic beams, okay? So you can simply create a vapor. So you evaporate some atoms in your chamber up to a control vapor pressure, okay, which depends on the temperature you set. This leads to flux of 10 to the 8 atom or so in the MOT. But it does not demand that you have a beam, an oven, a Zeeman slower, extra 2D MOT and so it makes the system more compact. The vacuum is somewhat limited because this very pressure that you have to build to load is also the one that is responsible for the losses. So if you have very low vapor pressure, you have no losses, but you have no incoming atoms. So you typically are in the range of 10 to minus millibar, and this makes your experiment relatively simple. But this is not accessible to all atomic species. Okay? An atomic beam is more general. It delivers much larger flux, but it makes that your experiment will be like meter long. You typically have to have some differential pumping in between the region where you create the beam and where you trap the atom, so it's more complex. And somewhat this 2D MOT is a nice toy because it delivers a large flux in a relatively small volume. Differential pumping is just ensured by this little hole through which the atom exits, and it makes the experiment somewhat intermediate in terms of complexity. Et ben voilà. So I think with that I'm done. I just gave you here a couple of references on the radiation forces, some of the precursor papers on this laser cooling, the Doppler cooling as proposed in the 70s. For laser cooling, you can read the lectures of the Nobel Prize by Chu, Koentanuji, and Phillips, and you will have very lively and very exciting introduction to laser cooling, because in this Nobel lecture they also put their contribution in perspective in terms of career also. So for young scientists, I think it's very interesting to read that and see how those people have taken the opportunities they had at that time to do their research. And books, well, you have this nice book of Koentanuji that I recommend. There's this book on laser cooling and trapping by Metcalfe and Peter van der Straten. And for French people, especially in radiative forces, I recommend the lectures in the Collège de France from 1982-1993, where you have a lot of details, discussions, and models with a very insightful physical interpretation of all those processes. With this, I'm done.
Thanks very much. When you're talking about the Doppler cooling, you neglect when you're discussing. Thank you very much. So when you're talking about the Doppler cooler and the diffusion parameter that you have, you neglect atom scatterings, I guess, because they are all together.
Yes.
Is this something you can do, or just for the sake of the lecture? How does it relate to the diffusion parameter that you gave here? Is it much smaller?
Well, this will depend basically on the parameters. Here, so far, indeed, it's only diffusion with the photon somewhat. So there is no interaction with the atom. Interaction with the atoms you will have that do play a big role in the MOT. Okay. And then it will be responsible indeed for increase in the size, eventually of the temperature, and so. It's a phenomenon that it's hard to see in the optical molasses because the cloud is much bigger, so densities are smaller. But in the MOT, you have those processes at play. But I've not described them here, just gave a few orders of magnitude, but these are the processes that can play a role. What I've insisted on is more related to photon reabsorption, so it's really. But you can see that as an effective, somewhat two-atom interaction, because if the photon gets reabsorbed, okay, in the picture of you have this pair of atoms. It's really like a repulsive force. So it plays the same role as this like two-body interaction. But I think this two-body interaction in the MOT will be small with respect to those processes. They do play a role, probably more when you have atoms at very high densities in magnetic traps or dipole traps.
Okay, I think we stop here. Anyway, you have more lectures. So.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Bon.